And we are live. Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome in to our author event with JR Dawson, author of The First Bright Thing. I'm Josh. I'm one of the librarians here at LPL. So I will introduce Jen and get us kicked off a little bit, and then we will dive right into tonight's event. Thank you all for tuning in live, or if you come back to this recording after the fact, thank you for taking the time to listen in. Well, I'm very excited to be able to welcome Dawson to the library to talk about this book. I'm a huge fan, and so this is a lot of fun. So I'll just start off. JR Dawson is a writer and educator with shorter works that are published in places such as Fantasy and Science Fiction, the year's best science fiction and fantasy for 2018, and Lightspeed magazine. She currently lives in Omaha with a loving spouse and 3 dogs. She earned a BFA from the theater school at DePaul and an MFA in creative writing from Stonecoast. Dawson works as a teaching artist with various nonprofits that bring the power of the performing arts to children in the Midwest. And The First Bright Thing is her first novel. So Jen, thank you for being here tonight.
Much for having me, Josh.
Yeah. So to start us off, just tell us a little, what is the book about for those who haven't read it?
Yeah, for sure. So it is a magical circus in 1926. And it is actual magic. At the end of World War I, something happened that cracked something open in the world that caused people to wake up. Just random people with random powers, and each person has a different spark. So some of these performers can travel through time. Some of them are clairvoyant. One is a healer. One is an illusionist. And so they use these powers instead of like taking over the world. They decide to open up a circus, which kind of becomes the safe haven for them. Because sparks are not considered, they're not always included in the kindness of humans, and they're kind of outsiders. And so that's sort of the premise. And then we have kind of the smaller, well, not the smaller, the more personal story of the rival circus, which is also a bunch of sparks, but they're not as cuddly, and they're out to kind of like ruin people's lives. And they're coming for the main circus because there's something that the ringmaster has that they want. And then also, while this is happening, because there's a clairvoyant person and there's a time traveler, they see that there is something barreling towards them from the future that they're going to try to stop. And it looks like another war. So it's a jam-packed book full of a lot of queer joy and hopefully hope and theater nerdiness.
Excellent. So for those who are viewing along, we're going to open with a bit of a reading from the book, and then we're going to go into just kind of a discussion about the novel and creative works in general. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for audience questions. So if you are viewing on Facebook, or if you're here in the Zoom webinar on Zoom, drop those into the Q&A section. If you're on Facebook, put those in the comments, and we'll set aside some time for those at the end. But feel free to enter those at any point in the event, and we'll do our best to get to them. With that being said, I will turn it over to Jen for the reading, and then we'll take it from there.
Awesome. So I have just decided I'm going to go and read the first part of it. So there won't be any spoilers or anything. So this is the very first chapter. The First Bright Thing, Chapter 1, The Ringmaster, 1926. The Spark Circus rolled into town on a Tuesday early in the morning. The well-worn train snuck onto the tracks right outside of town as the birds woke and the dawn broke through the sleepy shadows of trees cloaked in an early mist. Train spotters didn't notice the train's approach until it was nearly upon them, appearing in a blink and charging into town, the cars red and gold and blue with a name written along the side. Wendy Van Houten's Circus of the Fantasticals. The last 2 cars were purple and gold with flowers painted on their thick, sturdy wood siding. the windows laced with red curtains. Today, here in Des Moines, there had been tracks for the train to appear on. On other days, in other towns, the train just arrived in the middle of a field with not a rail yard around for miles, like magic. But no, it was Sparks. The Circus of the Fantasticals worked on upfront deposits, meticulous yet flexible planning, and well-placed advertisements like all circuses, but something more than a seasonal schedule also drove this particular train. The Spark Circus always arrived at the right place at the right time, even if it was just for one person who needed to see their show that night. In a decade where the past was a nightmare and the future was a dream, the present was an unknown sort of way station where everyone seemed a little lost. Some would recall their visit to the Circus of the Fantasticals vividly as a pivot in their lives. Others would simply be inspired to do better or think differently with no catalyst they could quite put their finger on, but would likely trace back to that one time they went to see the circus. Today, June 8th, 1926, was Des Moines, Iowa's turn. By the time the city awoke, the circus was set up in their rented plot near the tracks. Some townsfolk skipped work, and most children ran from chores to watch on the plot's outskirts, while the Sparks emerged from the train cars to put up the big top and make the midway appear. One Spark changed into an animal. Another multiplied themselves to get things done faster, while another lifted wagons above their head. The townsfolk might have been slightly afraid, but as the day got older and the posters went up all over town, as they watched with growing fascination, they realized this might be their only chance to see something extraordinary, and so they went to the circus. The midway held the youth of smoky July evenings and the feeling of a young body rushing down a very steep hill. Something in the electric string lights hanging above, the musical chime of carnival games and candy carts, brought back a safe home that everyone seemed to remember but had never been able to find until tonight. There was a squeal and a small stampede of children dragging their mothers to follow them up a little wooden bridge. The bridge led to the sideshow, which was for everyone, not just gentlemen, and it wasn't a cheap exploitation. It may have only been made of plywood and luminescent paint, but it still held something exciting in the way it invited the audience to run through it, to explore in their own way. Halfway through, giggling children bounced on a rubber bridge with just enough give, and their parents stood in awe inside a tunnel that looked like it spun through outer space. It was technology carved and moved by wooden gears, like something out of George Millier's dreams. But the big top itself, the archetypal main event, was admittedly nothing special. In fact, it looked more beaten down than other passing circuses that townspeople had seen before. The tent was tattered red and white canvas and muslin, thriftily yet expertly sewn together. The audience seats were only benches on bleachers set in a circle outside rings of flimsy painted sawdust curbs, with areas on the ground level for those who would have trouble climbing up the rickety steps. The floor was dust that was easy to traverse, but still coated boots and wheels and nice Sunday shoes all the same. The lights were too sharp, too few, and seemed mostly to spotlight just how dirty and ramshackle the inside of this big top was. It seemed to resemble a barn more than a theater, held together by spit and glue rather than nails. But that was just the pre-show. When the tent went to blackout, when the audience hushed and the spotlight clicked on, there, in the halo of illumination, stood the ringmaster. Commanding in a bright red velvet coat, the ringmaster looked out to the audience from the center of a large ring. Middle-aged and looking every bit a lioness, the ringmaster had a wild mane of golden brown hair that frizzed in the heat, didn't dry fast enough in the cold, and was somehow always getting in her white face, which was either sunburned with 1,000 freckles or as pale as a ghost in winter. She had black eyes, unheard of, that either glimmered with possibility or dulled with the density of a black hole. Some thought she was beautiful, some thought she was brash, but it was undeniable that she would take them on an adventure. When she smiled, It seemed to the crowd like she was looking at the world for the first time, as if she had just caught her first glimpse of them, saw the brilliance of their hearts, and had known what great things they'd already done and would do. The smile was a genuine embrace, the first bright thing in this dark, dusty place. Welcome, she said to every single person in the audience. Welcome home. Thank you.
Excellent, Jen. Thank you. I just have to say, I read this book even before it came out because of librarian perks, and I loved it very much. Magical books like this are just so much fun in general. And you said that you hope that you captured hope in this one, and it absolutely does. But it's hope in a challenging world, like you said at the beginning. It's post-war. These are outsiders in their own society. There's a lot of struggles that they're facing. And just even from that line, the welcome home is such a core piece of this. And it's very meaningful to read, and you did an excellent job with it. So
Thank you.
yeah, so we'll kick off some of our discussion. Just in general, tell us a little bit about the origin of this book. Where did the idea come from, and kind of how did it grow along the way from idea to debut novel that got incredible promotion? It was fun to see the book tour and all the people that really embraced it once it came out.
Yeah, it's been a really fun summer. Yeah, so it came from a bunch of different places. It was kind of one of those things where as a writer, you kind of have like scrap paper in your brain of like all of these different ideas, and then it just kind of smushes together one day. So I had a piece of scrap paper that was, a circus story. And then I had one about this idea of the sparks of this little girl who was an illusionist, and her dad was trying to hide it from the world. And that character ended up becoming Joe Reed, who's the ringmaster's kind of like ward or mentee. Big brother, big sister, big little sister. But yeah, so there was that. There was also just growing up and being an adult in like an artistic community of friends, just seeing all of these wonderful people that I knew that were writers and cooks and photographers and visual artists, like painters and sculptors and musicians and all of these people. And each one of my friends is just like this amazing little bundle of amazingness, like where not only are they good people who have sparks or skills like being a person, but also in creating this art that kind of reflects who they are. And so seeing this in this cluster of folks, it kind of like put the seed there for this circus of this found family where everybody has something to give. That was one of the big things that I kept in mind when writing this, is that the overall message was going to be you're enough. And this was kind of my love letter to people that I know, being like, hey, you're super cool. Like you're super talented and you have something to give the world just the way you are. And then also, just you did the darker stuff. I was going through some stuff, just you kind of heal through writing, a little bit of self-therapy. And I also really have always loved the performing arts. I love a good ethical circus. I think that some of the physicality of especially like the aerialists is out of this world and magical. So yeah, came from a lot of different places.
Yeah. So kind of following up on that, like I know that you've got a background in theater and you've mentioned a lot of different creative arts. Was there something particular about the circus? What was it, that physicality, or was there more to it that made that like the ideal setting for everything to grow out of?
Yeah, so my understanding of what a circus was at the beginning of all of this is very different than my understanding at the end of it. So I at the time was working at a children's theater that was in an old vaudeville theater. So like every day I was giving these tours talking about what vaudeville was to like third graders. And seeing that vaudeville is where, musical theater came from. And so I think that in my head, I had kind of smushed like, oh, well, the circus is just kind of like a sibling to the other performing arts, like vaudeville and musicals and plays. And it's something where everybody gets to kind of show their act or their spark. And as I got further into the book, I realized no, they are not siblings. They're like second cousins. They originate from like two different places. Like vaudeville comes from more of the performing arts, and the circus actually comes from roots in kind of colonizing roots. Like it's traveling zoos and World's Fair are the two big reasons why circuses exist. And the way that circus performers, like circus folk, go into their performance is not so, I mean, like every art tells a story, but it's a much more spectacle, and it's much more physical, I think. It's much more like a dance than it is like just straight play. So everything is connected, but it is definitely a different vibe. So I think that that's where I started, and then where I ended was like, oh, this still fits. It's just I've learned so much. Which I love that Rin, the ringmaster, is a theater kid. She grew up in the early 20th century theater in the East Coast, and she also finds this out throughout the book, and it kind of has to be put in her place. Like, no, it's not called a stage manager; it's a production manager, and stuff like that. So,
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, no, it's always so much fun what you learn once you go into writing, learning about some of these topics. Because I know so many of the books I see here in the library, there's lists of like the works consulted at the back, and writers get to do these deep dives and into sometimes very niche and very fascinating topics.
oh yeah.
So I've heard you talk a little bit about this at other events, and I believe you mentioned that this was not originally Rin's story when you first conceptualized it.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about that main character and how she kind of stepped into the center of the ring, shall we say?
Yeah. So it was originally Joe's story. It started from a very different place, about this girl who had gone through some family trauma, and she had this special ability that her family was trying to stifle, and so she runs off to join the circus. Um, and it was her kind of stuck between these two different ringmasters. The baddie that they're running away from in the book is called the Circus King, and so she's kind of stuck between the Circus King and the ringmaster, and like who's going to be her mentor, like which way is she going to take this illusionist spark that she has, like how does she take responsibility for her art. And then as the story grew, Rin, who had started off as kind of like Silas from Graveyard Book, just kind of like mysterious mentor character, started just doing a lot. Like when she was off screen, or off the page, like she was off doing these big things that were way bigger than what Joe was doing. Until it got to the point where my editor's like, Rin is your main character. We're not seeing half the story on the main page. So it ended up being the same story, and a lot of people who a lot of like my friends who read very early drafts of when it was Joe, like now that the book is coming out and they're reading it, it's like, well, it's the same story, it's just from a different perspective and a different focus.
Just like in The Hobbit, Gandalf disappears for days on end and then comes back. It's like, oh, we don't need to talk about that.
Talk about it. Sometimes things happen, whatever.
Yeah. So speaking of some of those other side characters, there is very much this found family that comes together. What was it like finding some of these other characters as they kind of made their way into the troop. And along with that, what was it like finding their powers? Because the powers and the characters are tied so closely together.
Yeah, they are.
Did that come naturally, and did you know who they were right off, or did you kind of have to find these people for yourself as the story developed?
It was funky because some of their sparks came before I figured out who they were, and then some of them came with their sparks. So it was super like organic. The first spark that I came up with, other than Joe's illusionist thing, which that kind of just came as a package, was Tina, because I was like, well, if I'm going to do a circus, I want to do an ethical one where everybody has to consent, but I really love animals. So there has to be an animorph. And so Tina can transform into any animal. And I was like, well, what kind of person would take great joy in that? And so I really love Tina. Edward definitely came with his spark. He's a character who I've sort of had in my back pocket for a while, and I've tried to write him in many different projects, and it just never worked. Edward, as somebody who has some control issues, I was like, what would a narcissist spark look like? And what does that feel like being on the other end of that? And so Ed definitely came with his spark. When it came to the three women who, I call them like the coven or the Fibonacci sequence. There's three women who are the ones who go through time and really lead the circus and own the circus. And that's Ringmaster, who's a time traveler, Odette, who is her wife, and an aerialist and a healer, and Mauve, who is their friend, and she is a singer and a clairvoyant. She also does all of the financing. And so clairvoyance, healing, and time traveling kind of came from me needing to build a party that would be, not dead when jumping around time and space. So how are they going to do that? Where are they going? How are they not going to die? And then it was so interesting with Rin, because Rin definitely has some PTSD, and from that comes how a brain on PTSD works, or on PTSD with PTSD works. And so she's very cyclical and nonlinear in her thinking and in the way that her spark works. And Odette, I was like, why would Odette have this power? Like, what sort of person would this be? And I don't think that I really got a hold of who Odette was until my spouse pointed out that I was married to Odette, and that helped a lot. So yeah, it just, like, long story short, it was like sort of weirdly organic. They just sort of popped up with their powers.
Mm-hmm. I love it. And so that kind of leads into the next one. You've talked about the time travel, and there's two timelines in the book. There's very global events, and there's very personal events, with 2-3 kind of interwoven storylines. What was it like pulling all of that together into one novel and making them all feed into each other?
Yeah, I don't know. It was all blurred. Yeah, no, I mean, my brain works in a weird way where I feel like I have like 10 different like windows open in my brain internet screen at a time. So that's just kind of how my brain works. But to make it, like, as a writer, you have to make all of this stuff thread together. And so asking a lot of questions like, what does World War II have to do with the past? What does the Circus King wanting to come into the circus have to do with World War II? And what does Rin have to do with any of it? And so I know that a lot of writers make like charts to kind of chart how things go, and that doesn't really work for me because it's so fluid in my head. So it's a lot of just writing a bunch of scenes and then trying to smush them together in a way that makes sense. And in a way that flows and kind of shows the point you were trying to make. And if there was something that really wasn't serving the larger like inside world, external world, how are they going together, then it would get cut. So put that MFA to work.
Yes. It's funny how story ideas seem so great until you have to sit down and actually write them. And then you're like, what have I got myself into here?
Yep. Yeah, this is true.
Thankfully, when they come together, everybody else benefits from being able to see the final product. But kind of spinning off of that, like that you mentioned, like that core idea and serving the story. And one of the core ideas you've said and from the book is that identity and belonging, because it is very much centered on people who seemingly don't belong in where they are. Can you talk a little bit about um, why you wanted to write that and what was it like bringing that to kind of out of this found family magical circus story?
Yeah. So wow, this is a big answer. Okay. Let me put all my little window screens together. So as somebody who is non-binary, queer, and Jewish in Omaha, Nebraska in 2023, super fun. No problems here. But so a lot of the time when we talk about queer stories, I'm not seeing a lot of Midwestern queer stories. And it is really weird being an outsider in a space where um it's your hometown, but it's not safe. And how do you find each other? And what does that look like in queer history? How have we found each other in the past with like coding, the way that we walk or talk or dress, with like secret speakeasies or hangout spots that still exist today? Like I read Samantha Allen's Real Queer America, that was talking about how different like bars and community centers will put something outside to indicate like, hey, this is a safe space for you. This is our space. And so I kind of took that and put that in the lantern outside the speakeasy in the book. But yeah, it is a lot of stress. And I mean, and this is coming from somebody who is mostly able-bodied and who is white. It is a lot more difficult for a lot of people. And how does one navigate living in a space that isn't necessarily kind, especially recently? So that anxiety and that dissonance kind of made its way into the book, which it was really interesting because about a week before the book came out, we realized we were going to have to move because of stuff that's happening here in Nebraska. We need to go to a sanctuary state. And also just like there's this weird thing that happens in theater where a lot of us are marginalized in some way, but we're the people making the art. And that's fine as long as we aren't too weird. Like as long as we keep to our art and we don't come off the stage and get out of our lane or whatever. That art is historically kept alive by patronage that is more mainstream. And so we can be up on the stage, but we can't be in the audience, which I think is very interesting, and kind of heartbreaking. So yeah, so it was just kind of putting that all together, and how do you carve out a home and a found family in a safe place in a world that isn't always safe.
Yeah, and the speakeasy scene that you mentioned from the book is one of the scenes that absolutely stuck with me. The joy of belonging that is created in spaces like that where people who are outside are able to feel safe with each other. And I just remember like the way that was delivered and the realization for those who hadn't experienced that as much. Because like you said, like the Sparks are putting themselves front and center, but then the moment the show is done, they have to start being careful again, which is such a, like you said, a strange tension.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, so often creatives are the outsiders and the dreamers who just see things a bit differently, like across the whole spectrum of identities, but just looking at the world with a different set of eyes that is not always clearly understood. So
Yeah.
yeah, and it really does give a heart to the book in the midst of everything else that's going on. So
It was like
um
the last scene that I wrote too. That's yeah, it's funky that that's the last scene.
that's so interesting. That
Yeah.
yeah, but people who are able to write stories non-linear linearly, it's always interesting like where things land in the progression of the narrative as it actually plays out.
Yeah.
So related to everything that you've just been saying, the book deals with a lot of very heavy things, globally and personally.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes there's a inclination, or sometimes maybe just the easy way, to give a simple happily ever after when it's all done. And the book, I'm not saying that there isn't happiness there, but it is not simple answers, and it is not all tied up in a neat little bow by the end.
Mhm.
What was it like figuring that out, for the character's personal growth, but this big world at war that they are trying to comprehend as well?
Yeah, I think that that really came from the ending was the easiest part to write, weirdly enough. Like it just sort of was a bit one day and I was like, "Oh, that's cool." So the ending just kind of stayed the way that it was. I really pulled from how I was personally feeling about some of the things that were happening nationally and globally. There have been a lot of moments in like the last 7 years where I'm just kind of like, wow, this is gonna get really bad. And how am I going to continue to live a life? How is my family going to continue to live a life full of joy when you can see all of this coming down the pike and you keep waiting for somebody to come swooping in and fix it or save everyone, or oh, JK, it was all a joke, never mind. And it just doesn't happen. It just keeps getting worse and worse. Like as a millennial, like, you know, things changed a lot at very formative years, like globally. And it sort of hit the ground running and never stopped and just kept snowballing, from, you know, people dying to wars to all of the stuff that we're dealing with now. So as somebody who attempts to be an optimist, how does one hold on to optimism and hope when there really isn't any cause for hope? And this book really helped me through that. And then also through the summer where like I'm sitting in my office, which I'm not going to have in 2 weeks, and how do you hold space in a space that has like a countdown on it, a timer on it? And you know, you just take it one moment at a time and enjoy the seconds that you do have, which is sometimes all we have. But yeah, joy is an act of resistance, and join the resistance. What do they say in Star Wars? Ignite the spark, light the fire.
Yeah.
Like that, light the spark, ignite the fire. That's what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point too. Like the joy and just the wonder, because we've talked a lot about the darker side of this book, but there is a lot of just wonderful magic in it as well, and the celebration, the creativity. Like as people, what keeps us coming back to art and to circus and performance? And what does that joy look like, and that creativity and that beauty?
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting, like to hear everyone's relation to circus, because I was just talking to a bookseller in Colorado like a couple days ago, and she's like, I think circuses are like just a very Midwestern thing. And I was like, I mean, I've lived in the Midwest my whole life, so I mean, I guess, like, I don't know if that's true or not. But like a lot of people are like, circuses, and the other people are like, oh, circuses. And but I do think that across the board, people's eyes light up when you ask them to talk about their favorite piece of art. If that's, going to the Art Institute in Chicago, or if it's going to the game store and playing a campaign that's been running for 5 years with their besties. So I think that storytelling and expression through art is just really important. And there is something really magical about it. And it's centering, and it gives us ways to express ourselves when we don't necessarily have those ways imbued inside of us. So I think that there's joy and there's hope and there's understanding when it comes to our favorite stories and our favorite works of art, whatever that might be. And that was really interesting to see at the beginning of the pandemic, like everyone just sort of started reading again and watching really weird Netflix shows and, kind of coming together through story. And that seemed to be the most prominent way that at least Americans were coping. So
Yeah, I just remember everybody suddenly had sourdough starter and was
oh
baking
my God, that's right. Cooking
little
too.
loaves of bread, and it
Yeah.
was the most delightful thing to watch happen.
Yeah, I never got to the sourdough levels of things, but I went hard on Animal Crossing. Animal
Yeah,
Crossing was my jam that
it came out at the perfect time for everybody.
it really did.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Being in a library, I was just looking at a children's book the other day about this character called Stickler, which was this little like bundle of sticks that was walking around. And he takes his friend on a journey, and they're just like walking through the woods, looking at the forest and the sky and the wind, and it's all just like the pure simple beauties. And yeah, like whatever else is going on, people get excited by simple, beautiful, happy things. I mean, it's wired into us,
Mhm.
and so I think being able to embrace that is such an important piece of things as well.
Oh yeah.
So I have a couple more questions, but we are winding down on the discussion. So if anyone who is tuned in has things that you would like to know or hear us talk about, feel free to share those, and we'll get to that shortly. Um, but I'm just curious. So we've talked a lot about the book and your process with this, but speaking of art and creativity more broadly, what does your process of creating look like? Does it vary when you're doing theater versus fiction? Just how do you approach creating works like this?
Yeah, so my playwriting is very much I write it a lot like I write my fiction. It's instead of collaborating right off the bat. I guess that with playwriting, I have my collaborators like in mind immediately, like, okay, I am in charge of the dialogue. I am in charge of what the structure of the plot is and what the feeling of these characters are. But a director is going to come in and block it, and actors are going to be assigned each character and they're going to develop it. And then a set designer is going to come in and do the set. So I need to put enough direction up there that somebody reads it and can imagine it, and there is a direction, but I don't have to worry about it. And in writing, you are the whole caboodle, and the collab is a different sort of thing where you're working with your editor. The editor is more of a dramaturg than a director. And then like your set designer is like who makes your cover, which this is a gorgeous cover that Katie Klim did. And so like there's like publicity, marketing, all of these things that are kind of like on the outskirts of the story, like in real world, where where is the story going to be? Where we have that in theater, like people making playbills and people being house managers and box office and marketing and publicity, all that's there. But when it comes to the story on the stage, there's a lot more collab. So you are the person who has to put all of the different details about the thing that people are looking at, and you have to figure out all of the characters' deep dark secrets and really push them. But yeah, I also am just kind of a chaos gremlin when it comes to writing, where as a recovering as like a student, like I will hit the deadline. I do a lot of outlining like in my head. I'm a plancer. So like I do a lot of listening to Spotify, listening to songs, and the songs get me through. A lot of talking out loud and planning, and then going and writing like bare bones scenes, and then going and putting in all the fancy stuff. And then revising from there. So yeah, it's a mess over here, but it gets done.
Yeah. And for those who are not writers, can you just explain what does planter mean?
Yeah, so the two things that you can be are a plotter and a pantser. And then there's us weird little gremlin here that's the planter. So a plotter means that you plot everything out, you know how it's gonna end. Like you have your outline, you know your beginning, you know your middle, you know the last page, like you got this, and then you go into it and like kind of flush it out. Whereas a pantser is just like, I don't know. Once upon a time, there was a bear in the woods, and then he turned left, and then we'll see what happens. And you have no idea where you're going. So a planter, so what I do is I have like, when I start a story and I'm like, okay, does this have enough guts and bones that I can like shove it into a body? Like I have to think about, okay, who is the protagonist? What do they want? Who is the antagonist? What do they want? What is the massive external conflict that affects everybody? What is the internal conflict? How are those connected? What would the opening image be? What is the closing image? What is that big moment like in the climax? And if I have all of that and an interesting world and a couple of supporting characters that I can deal with, then we have an outline. But there's really nothing else. There's just bloop 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 until it starts looking like a book. So yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I know here with our library patrons, we have some people who are interested in writing creative art. So it's always interesting to hear people's process, because I think every writer is chaotic in some way, but it's different for every writer out
Yeah.
there. So it's fun to hear people talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's important as a writer. I know that like when I started out, I was like, okay, there is a way I have to do this. Like I have to start chapter 1, and then I have to go chapter 2, and it has to be like this, and it has to mirror itself, and blah blah, like all of these rules, and I have to write 300 words a day, and blah blah blah. And then I would feel guilty if I wasn't following that rigid like on writing schedule. And I see a lot of my students. I'm a private tutor for fiction writing, and a lot of my students are starting out and they feel really bad and weird. Like they're like, "Oh, I've got this weird like Pinterest board," and I'm like, "Good," because in the real world, your cover artist is going to ask to see it. Like, and so I would say that whatever feels comfortable for you and what is your process, that is the thing that you are supposed to be doing. So if you write 50 words every night at 3 a.m., except on Fridays, and you have to be eating crumble cookies while you do so, like that's probably not great for your health, but also like yummy, and do it. So
Yeah, that's funny. I've heard writers talk about like they're out in their writing shed in their backyard with no internet at like 8 a.m. every day. And there's
no.
others that are like scribbling novels on napkins in a coffee shop at 9 at night,
Yeah.
and everything in between.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Be true to yourself. Do the thing.
So as much as you can share with us, what is in the work next? Is there another book coming, or is there anything else that you're working on?
Yeah. So I have my next book with Tor coming out sometime in the next couple of years. My deadline is tomorrow for the second draft. So it has a beginning, middle, and end, and I wrote end last night. So it is a book. It exists. It does not have a title yet, but I'm gunning for We Were a Lighthouse. So it takes place in Chicago in 2005. It has Lake Michigan as the river Styx, and it is a sapphic story where Charon falls in love with Orpheus. And so that's the short pitch. The chaotic pitch is that the ferryman is retiring and is going to pass over through the veil and is leaving the psychopomp job to his daughter, but there's a couple of things that are happening. One, there's a demon that he trapped in the water tower that he didn't tell her about. And also there is a live woman on her boat her first night out, and she's pretty. So and she's looking for somebody. So it's a love story. It's a lot about death and what does that mean when we are living. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so a quick pitch for anyone who does listen to this, who is a Lewiston Public Library patron. We do have a copy. This is the library copy, so be sure to check this out. And I know that there are others circulating in the library system as well. But Jen, for anyone who wants to pick up this book in particular, or if anyone wants to connect with you online, where can they find you and the book after we're done here?
Yeah, so jrdawsonwriter.com is my website. Right now, my link tree is in my Instagram at JR Dawson Writer. And I'm still on the Bird site for now. It's J_R_Dawson. And I'm also on Blue Sky now, as just JR Dawson. I got there early, so JR Dawson.
And the book is available pretty much anywhere books are sold, correct?
Oh yeah. Barnes and Noble has a bunch. Half Price Books has it. Like Half Price Books is awesome. And yeah, some indie stores and
Yeah,
etc.
I
Yeah.
would imagine on bookshop.org too, if you want to support
Yes.
local bookstores.
Yes.
So I've got one question coming in. Who is your favorite character to write?
It depends on the day. Uh I think that my comfort character is Bernard. I think that the one that I stretched the most as a writer and learned the most from was Ren. She was really difficult to write. Ed was a very interesting character to write as a writer. Like villains are always a way to stretch some muscles and make people squiggy, which with the horror in this book, like, like it's like, oh, this is something I don't usually do, so that's super cool. So those are probably the three that I was the most interested in writing.
Yeah, I can only imagine getting into, without spoiling anything, a character like Edward for so much of the book,
Yeah.
and to deliver it with complexity, but also like still convey who and what he is over the course of it.
Right.
I can only imagine the challenge that might pose, artistically.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like, so somebody asked me once, like not once, like this summer, was it hard writing Ed? And Ed was probably the easiest one to write. Like I wrote all of his stuff one night back in 2018, and boom, it was there. And then everything else had to come. Ed was a little freeing because when you've known somebody like Edward in real life, sometimes they like to have the entire narrative be their narrative. So in writing a character where you get to kind of narrate it and take back the story was really great and cathartic. I didn't have a problem with the Ed chapters until I heard Tim Campbell on the audiobook, which if the audiobook, Tim Campbell reads the Ed chapters, and I was stuck on a plane. Like I was trapped on a plane with Tim Campbell, and I texted him and I was like, you owe me therapy bills. Like it was so horrifying. I was like, I don't know if I can get through my own book. So
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, there's something special about getting the right actor to take your words and just bring them to life.
yes, I was really looking forward to the audiobook because of that theater nerdiness. So
So another one coming in from Facebook. If you could have any of the Sparks powers, which one and why?
okay, so when I started all of this, my answer was rims, but then after writing it, I was like, never, no, no, thank you. I would really love Joe's. There are some days where I'm like, oh, I really would like Odette's. Like I have a rolled ankle right now, and I'm like, Odette. But Joe's, I think, like on a day-to-day basis would be really beautiful.
Yeah, just the raw creativity
Yes.
is something special.
Oh yeah.
I'll give it one more moment if there's any final questions, and if not, we will wind down today. Um, while I wait for that, I just want to say, Jen, thank you so much for joining us for this.
Yes, thanks for having
Um, I was very excited in the lead up to this book and then after its release. And so being able to hang out with you tonight and chat about all of this and the process has been very fun.
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
Um, and yeah, so for anyone who tuned in, this will be recorded. It will be available on the library's Facebook page, and we'll be sharing it to YouTube. So if you know anyone who would be interested in watching the event, definitely send them in that direction. Buy the book. Books make great gifts. Hand it out to everyone you know. But yeah, thank you for tuning in, Jen. Thank you. I hope all goes well with transitions.
Thank you.
Um, and I'm sure we all very much look forward to what you do next as well. So we'll stay tuned for that release whenever it comes, because the
Yeah.
creative arts are always a flexible thing.
Yeah, especially during a move. So
Yes.
yeah.
But good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.